The auctioneer had been asking $50 for 6 minutes and could not get a hand to come up. It was the 8th of October, 1994, a hard, bright Saturday on the old Creel place 2 miles south of Wardlow in Carrow County, Missouri, and Farrell Nunley had run better than 400 lots off that farm since 8 that morning. By 3 in the afternoon, the crowd was down to the people who stayed to the end, and the last lot of the day sat out in the open where 2 tractors had dragged it that morning on a pair of skids, because it had not been out of that barn since Eisenhower's first year, and nobody was willing to swear the wheels would turn. It was a hearse, a horse-drawn one, 12 feet long in the body and better than 9 feet to the top of the carved urn on its roof, standing on 4 iron-shod wooden wheels that came up to a man's chest. Both long sides were glass, tall etched panels of it, set between carved columns with gilt rope molding twisted up them. 2 nickel lamps the size of milk pails at the front corners. A driver's box with a leather dash cracked to alligator hide. The black lacquer had gone the gray of a chalkboard under 50 years of pigeons and hay chaff, and yet if you walked right up on it, the gold pinstripe was still there. One unbroken line the whole 12 feet, laid on by somebody whose brush never wobbled once. Nunley opened it at $300 because he had to. He came down to $150. He came down to $75. He said no interest at $50. No interest in the flat voice a good auctioneer uses when he wants a lot finished and off his hands, and the crowd started helping him finish it. Somebody said you could not insure it. Somebody said the horses to pull it had been dog food since Truman. A fellow near the front asked Nunley whether it came with a customer, and got his laugh. And then Truett Vance, who bought and sold at every sale in 4 counties and wore the same mustard-tan jacket to all of them, slid his sale bill out from under his arm, pointed it at the thing, and said, loud enough to carry to the porch, Farrell, "That's a greenhouse with a job nobody wants." That was the biggest laugh of the day. Which is when a heavy man in blue denim bib overalls and a straw hat gone the color of weak coffee raised one finger about as high as his belt buckle and said, 60, the ask was $50. He bid $60. There is a particular sound a crowd makes when it has decided a man just embarrassed himself, and it is not really laughter. It sits lower than laughter, and it goes on longer. 200 people had watched an old fellow in overalls bid against nobody out loud in front of his neighbors and bid himself up while he did it, for a wagon the whole county had already agreed was a hazard on wheels. Nunley did not ask twice. He said sold, said the number, and moved on, and behind him the laughing picked back up in a different key. Not at the wagon anymore, at the man. His name was Delbert Prine. Everybody called him Del. He was 62 years old, he lived 4 miles up the Cane Fork Road, and he had carried the mail on rural Route 3 out of Wardlow for 31 years, which meant that on that particular Saturday afternoon, he knew more about the people standing in that yard, their names, their kin, their mailboxes, their bad winters, than any other living soul in Carrow County. That is not why he bid, either. He bid because of 8 years he had spent before the mail route ever started, between 1950 and 1958, working for the man who had owned that wagon, and because of one small brass keyhole that every person in that yard had been looking straight at without once seeing. If you've made it this far into Delbert Prine's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Delbert Prine went to work for Amos Creel in the spring of 1950, 18 years old, and stayed 8 years. Creel and Son had been burying Carrow County since 1898, Amos's father first and then Amos, out of a white frame building on the square at Pike Hollow. Del's job was the horses and the wagon. He curried them and harnessed them and drove them and stood at their heads in the rain while the service went on inside. And by 22 he could back that hearse through the gate of the Pike Hollow burying ground without touching either post, the only genuine skill, he would tell you, he ever picked up in his life. He knew that wagon the way you know a room in your own house in the dark. He knew the second step of the driver's box stood a quarter-inch proud and would catch your heel. He knew which pane rattled going over the plank bridge, and he knew that the offside deck rail, the long molded rail that ran the whole 12 feet under the glass, carved in a bead and reel pattern and lined in gold, had a keyhole in it. A keyhole the size of a thumbnail, brass, let into the molding about a third of the way back, and the carved beading ran around it so neatly that unless you were washing that rail with a rag in your hand, you could go your whole life without ever finding it. In 8 years, Delbert Prine never once saw it open. Amos Creel carried 3 things on his watch chain: the watch, a pocket knife, and a flat brass key about an inch long that fit no door in the building. Del asked about that key exactly one time, at 19. Creel looked at him and said, "That's the county's business." That was the entire answer, and Delbert Prine was not the kind of young man who asked twice. Creel died in 1961. Del was 3 years onto the mail route by then. The funeral home went to a nephew who had no use for horses, and the wagon went into the barn at the Creel place with its harness hung on a nail beside it, and there it stayed for 36 years, which is how a thing that took 4 men the better part of a year to build in 1901 ends up being worth $60 on a bright afternoon in October. Getting it home was the expensive part. He paid a neighbor named Bo Tackett $75 for the loan of a gooseneck trailer and a tractor with a loader on it. He paid a wheelwright out of Poplar Grove for $140 to come and look. The felloes were sound and the spokes were sound, but the iron tires had loosened on all 4 and would roll off if he moved it any distance. So they did not roll it. They lifted it on slings in 2 pieces, the body off the running gear, and it took most of a Sunday and 6 men, and one of the 6 was there strictly to watch the glass. Not one pane broke. 36 years in a barn with a hole in the roof, and every original pane still in its frame because the man who built it bedded them in cork instead of putty. Del's machine shed was 30 by 40 with a concrete floor, and by the middle of that week the wagon stood in the north end of it under 4 work lights. Carrow Prine, who had been married to him 38 years, came out with her coat on to look at it and asked him the only question she asked the whole winter. "What are you going to do with it, Del?" And he said he was going to clean it. That is what he did from the middle of October almost to Thanksgiving. Warm water, mild soap, cotton rags, and a great deal of patience. He did not strip anything, and he did not sand anything. He washed 50 years of chaff and pigeon lime off that wagon 1 panel at a time, and up out from under it came black lacquer and gold leaf and carved black walnut. And on the offside, about a third of the way back along the deck rail, the rag went over the keyhole. He sat down on an upturned bucket and looked at it for a while. Now, a good many men would have put a drill on it that same night. Delbert Prine did not own the kind of hurry that leads to that. What he did instead was back out the 2 small screws holding the brass escutcheon. The little plate that frames a keyhole, and lift it away, and behind it sat a lock mechanism the size of a matchbox, dry as a bone, with a bolt shot across in it and no key anywhere on this earth that he knew of. He worked at it 3 evenings with a length of piano wire bent into a hook, a shaving mirror, and a flashlight held in his teeth. And the shed got cold enough that he had to keep the wire in his shirt pocket between tries. On the 3rd evening, the 22nd of November 1994, something inside that rail went over with a small dry click that he felt in his wrist before he heard it. And the whole panel below the rail, better than 2 feet of carved bead and real molding that had looked for 93 years. Exactly like every other inch of molding on that wagon swung down on a pair of concealed brass hinges. Behind it was a drawer, 30 inches long, 4 inches deep, lined all the way around in sheet-zinc and built into the frame of the carriage itself so that it occupied space nobody would ever miss. In the drawer was an oilcloth roll tied shut with a shoelace. Inside the roll, a leather-covered book about the size of a hymnal, swollen at the spine but dry. 6 sheets of linen drafting cloth, folded in quarters, drawn on in India ink. A bundle of small brass tags on a wire ring, each one stamped with a number, and a stub of indelible pencil worn down to 2 inches. Del carried the roll into the kitchen, put it under the light over the table, and did not touch the book for 10 minutes. When he did open it, what he saw was columns, names down the left in a small upright hand, dates beside them, and then 2 more columns he could not make anything of at all. Page after page of it. His first thought, sitting there at 11 o'clock at night with his glasses on, was that he had an undertaker's day book, a list of funerals, which would have made an interesting case at the Historical Society, and nothing more. It was not a list of funerals. He understood that on the 4th page, and the reason he understood it is that he came to a name he knew, Docia Renfro. Beside her, in the 2nd column, a description that read Old Guard, N-Wall, 3rd for Locust. And in the 3rd column, in the same careful hand, R4N12. Delbert Prine sat in his own kitchen with his hand flat on that page, because he knew exactly what R4N12 meant, and so did every family in that county, and not one of them had ever been able to read it. To explain that, I have to take you back to 1953, and to a town that is not there anymore. Pike Hollow sat on the cane fork in the bottom of a narrow valley, a square, 2 churches, a bank, a mill, and Creel and Son on the corner. In 1951, the Corps of Engineers started a flood control dam 9 miles downstream, and when the gates closed in the fall of 1953, the water came up over the bottom land, over the Cane Fork Road, over the mill dam, over the square, and over the burying ground on the bench above the river where Pike Hollow had been putting its people since 1854. Everything above the take line got moved, everything below it got left. The living moved themselves. The dead had to be moved for them, and that work was let out on contract to a crew that was not from there. 214 graves came off that bench in the spring and summer of 1953. They went 4 miles up onto a new piece of ground the county had bought on Wardlow Ridge, laid out in 11 straight rows, and the crew set a granite block at the head of every one. The blocks were blank. Each had a number chiseled into the top face, running 1 through 214, and the understanding was that the contractor's paperwork would come back and the names would be cut into the stones the next year when there was money. The paperwork did come back. It was filed at the courthouse in Wardlow, in the north room of the vault. The courthouse burned on the 9th of February, 1968. Not all of it. The north room of the vault and everything that was in it, which included the road files, the drainage districts, and one folder of relocation records out of the Cane Fork project. And by then, the men who had superintended that work were mostly dead, and the widows who could have walked the rows and said she is here were mostly dead as well. And what the families who were left had were guesses. That is the word they used in that county. Guesses. For 41 years, 214 people lay on Wardlow Ridge under numbers. What Delbert Prine had on his kitchen table was not an undertaker's daybook. It was a removal register. Name, dates, where the grave had been in the old ground, described against a wall or a tree or a neighbor's stone. And where it had gone on the ridge, row and number. Amos Creel had been hired by Carrow County to superintend those removals, because he was the undertaker and because he was the only man still living who had been present at a good half of the original burials. And Amos Creel did not trust the contract crew to write anything down. So he wrote it down himself, in his own book, on the seat of his own hearse, in indelible pencil. And when the last row was set, he rolled it in oilcloth, laid it in a drawer nobody on earth knew about, and turned the key on his watch chain. That's the county's business. He never said one word about it, not to the commission, not to the nephew, not to the 19-year-old holding his horses. Whether he meant it as a safeguard or simply could not conceive that the county's own copy might fail, nobody can answer now. What is certain is that when the North Room burned in 1968, the only complete record of who lay where on Wardlow Ridge had already been sitting locked inside a wagon in a barn 4 miles away for 7 years, and it went on sitting there through 8 county commissions, 2 attempts at a memorial, and 1 newspaper series, none of which ever produced a single name. The 6 sheets of linen were the plats. The old burying ground drawn to scale, every grave numbered and lettered by a man who had helped dig most of them. Miriam Noakes ran the Carrow County Historical Society out of 2 rooms above the old feed store, and she had been trying to make people care about the cane fork removals for 30 years to no effect whatsoever. Del telephoned her the day after Thanksgiving. She admitted afterward that she had assumed he had a shoebox of postcards. She came out. She stood in a machine shed in her good coat, looking up at her hearse, then sat down at a kitchen table and read 4 pages, and then asked Delbert Prine for a glass of water and sat quiet for a minute. The verification took 11 weeks, and it turned on 2 stones. Of the 214 blocks on Wardlow Ridge, all but 2 are blank. 2 families in 1953 paid the contractor out of their own pockets to bring the original marble headstones up from the old ground and set them with the reburials. And those 2 stones stand in row 7, 3rd and 4th from the east end, carrying names, a Tandy and a Wilkerson. Creel's register, written 15 years before that fire and never once seen by anybody, puts a Tandy at row 7, number 3, and a Wilkerson at row 7, number 4. That was the first thing. The second thing was the plats. Miriam had in her files a photograph of the Pike Hollow burying ground taken in 1938 for a church anniversary, the stone wall, the gate. A big locust over the north corner. Creel's plat shows the wall, the gate, and the locust, with the graves keyed off all 3, and when they laid the photograph down beside the drawing, every feature on the one was on the other. The third thing was the brass tags. 19 were left on the ring, unused. They matched in size, in stamp, in the exact shape of the numerals. A corroded tag a groundskeeper had turned up with a mower blade in 1979 and dropped into a coffee can in the shed on Wardlow Ridge, where it had sat ever since. That tag is stamped 88. Line 88 of the register is a woman named Effie DeLashmet. Now I want to tell you about Ivy Hargrove, because this is the part of it that people in Carrow County still talk about. Ivy was 88 years old in the spring of 1995 and lived out on the Wardlow blacktop in a house with a glassed-in porch, and Delbert Prine had carried her mail for 31 years. Her mother, Docia Renfro, died in the influenza that went through that valley in 1949 and was buried at Pike Hollow. 4 years later, Ivy stood on Wardlow Ridge at 22 years old and watched a man with a clipboard sweep his arm across the middle of the fourth row and tell her, "She's somewhere along in there." Ivy Hargrove picked stone number 61 because it stood in the middle of where he pointed. And from Decoration Day of 1954 until Decoration Day of 1994, 41 years. She carried a quart jar of zinnias out of her own yard and set it against number 61 and pulled the grass around it with her hands and talked to it. Del drove out there on a Tuesday in March with a photocopy of one page. Docia Renfro. Row 4, number 12. Row 4, yes, but 12, not 61. 11 stones east of where Ivy Hargrove had been kneeling since Eisenhower. And then Del told her the other half of it because Miriam had made him look it up before he came. Stone number 61 on that ridge is a man named Cleophas Tandy, born 1871, died 1948. A teamster who hauled crosties out of that valley for 40 years and had no living kin anywhere by 1953. Ivy Hargrove listened to all of that and thought about it a while. And what she finally said was that a man ought not to go 41 years with nobody, and that she would just have to bring 2 jars. She did two jars every Decoration Day for the rest of her life. What was left was money, and money is where stories like this one usually die. 214 granite markers, cut, lettered, and set, priced out at a little over $32,000 in 1995. The county commission was sympathetic and said the thing county commissions say, which was that there was no line in the budget for it and there had not been one since 1954. Meanwhile, Truett Vance of the mustard-tan jacket drove out to Dell's place in April and offered $2,500 for the hearse, and when that did not move anything, $6,000. Word had gotten around by then. Dell told him it was not for sale to anybody who wanted it for what it was worth. Then Miriam Noakes did the thing Historical Society people are good at, which is writing letters. A carriage man came over from Lexington in June, spent 4 hours under that wagon with a flashlight and a tape, and told Dell exactly what he had been sleeping 50 feet from all winter, a glass-sided funeral carriage built in 1901 by a Cincinnati coachworks that shut its doors in 1919, one of a very small number left anywhere with its original glass, its original wheels, and its original paint still under the grime, not restored, not repainted. Original, the Trace River Carriage Museum over in Kentucky offered $46,000 for it in August of 1995. Delbert Prine sold it on 2 conditions he wrote out himself in pencil on a sheet of tablet paper. The wagon goes on display with that panel standing open and the drawer visible, and the original register goes to the Carrow County Historical Society, where anybody with a name can walk in off the street and look it up for nothing. 214 flat granite markers were cut that winter. Name, dates, and beneath each one the row and the number out of Amos Creel's book. What was left after the stones and the setting went into the mowing fund for Wardlow Ridge. And Delbert Prine kept none of it. They dedicated the ridge on the 9th of June, 1996, a Sunday. There were somewhere over 400 people on that hill, which is a good many more than had been on it in 1953. They read the names out loud, all 214 of them, and it took an hour and 10 minutes, and nobody left. Ivy Hargrove was 90 by then. She sat in a folding chair at the end of the 4th row with a jar of zinnias in each hand and waited for the 12th name. Truett Vance was there too. He stood at the back with his hat off, in the mustard tan jacket, and afterward he told a reporter from the county paper the truest thing anybody said all day, that he had been buying and selling other people's belongings for 26 years and had never one time in his life wondered what any of them was for. And here is the thing I keep coming back to about that wagon. It was built with glass sides. That was the entire point of it. A carriage made so that people could see in, so that nothing about it was hidden, so that a town standing on both sides of a road could look straight through and know exactly what was going past. 200 people stood around it in a sale yard on a bright October afternoon and looked right through it, and what they saw was a joke. Farrell Nunley's flat call, coming down and down. No interest at $75. No interest at $50. No interest. There was interest. 214 families worth of it, rolled in oilcloth and locked in a hollow rail 4 inches deep, behind a keyhole the size of a thumbnail, waiting out 41 years for the one man in that yard who had ever washed that rail with a rag in his hand and remembered a key on a dead man's watch chain. It cost $60. The price of a greenhouse with a job nobody wants.